Just a day before my art contest, my mother-in-law ruined my painting. But I laughed, because it was actually the best thing she could have done for me. My name is Taylor Swift. I'm 34 years old, living in Asheville, North Carolina. In a two-story brownstone tucked between a bookstore and a bike shop. I'm not a singer, and I'm not famous. I'm a self-taught painter, a part-time studio curator, and a former PR director who left a fast-track agency job 3 years ago when I realized I was spending more time writing scripts for other people's dreams than building my own. Back then, the decision sounded dramatic. To everyone else, I was throwing away a career that came with predictable bonuses, clean offices, and quarterly promotions. But I wasn't thriving. I was disintegrating. The day I left, I packed up my office into a single box, gave my team a quiet goodbye, and drove home without crying. That night, I didn't celebrate. I sat on the kitchen floor with an open jar of paint and stared at a blank canvas until the sun came up. That was the beginning. My husband Jonathan was supportive, at least at first. He liked the idea of me being free, even romanticized it. He helped convert the guest room into a makeshift studio, brought me coffee in the mornings, and told friends that his wife was finally doing what she loves. We lived modestly, but we were fine. He made good money as a structural engineer, and I picked up freelance writing projects when I needed to. For a while, it worked. Then came the invites. Family dinners. Gallery nights featuring Claire, his younger sister, a professionally trained painter with a fine arts degree, and a mother who believed every brushstroke she made should be framed and archived. Claire was polished and precise. She could talk about composition, theory, brush weight, and negative space. I could talk about color, memory, grief, and the way light feels when it lands on water at 6:47 in the morning. That difference might not have mattered in another family. But in Jonathan's family, Delilah, his mother, made it matter. Delilah Swift chaired one of Asheville's art councils, organized juried shows, and spent more time correcting gallery lighting than most people spent looking at the art from day one, and she treated my interest in painting like an amusing phase, something women with time and a husband's paycheck occasionally pursued until they got bored. "How lovely," she said once, after I'd shown her a study of river stones I'd been working on. Very therapeutic. That word lingered like a stain. When Claire got a solo show, the family rented a van and drove out of state to attend the opening. When I was accepted into a community pop-up, no one brought it up at dinner. And still, I kept painting. Over time, the comments grew sharper. "You're lucky you don't have to work," she'd say, tilting her wine glass. So few women have that luxury anymore. She never said the word artist. Not once. To her, Claire was the artist. I was Jonathan's wife, with a hobby. Still, I didn't fight back. I painted in silence. I spent hours in the studio, learning technique, the long way through mistakes. Not lectures. I read books. I watched old interviews. I experimented with oils, glasses, and dry brushing. Slowly, I got better. The small shows turned into features. The community space turned into a partnership. My confidence grew with each completed piece. Each comment from strangers who felt something when they looked at my work. Then, 2 months ago, I applied to the Colburn National Art Showcase. It was a long shot. A high-profile juried competition with only 30 finalist spots and hundreds of submissions from trained artists across the country. I didn't expect to get in, but I did. The acceptance email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I screamed so loud that my neighbor thought something was wrong. I printed it out and pinned it on the studio door. That night, Jonathan opened a bottle of wine and said he was proud. But something had shifted. I looked nervous. Not excited, nervous. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked. "It's a big audience. There'll be real professionals there." He blinked. "I am a real professional." He hesitated, then gave a small nod. The kind people give when they don't want to argue but also don't want to agree. I filed that look away. The painting I chose to submit was one I'd been building for months, layer by layer. It was a sunrise over Lake Santitla, a place from my childhood where the air felt clean and the silence didn't need to be filled. I'd painted the light, not just the scene, the shift in temperature between gold and blue, the low mist curling around a dock, the reflection that only lasts 3 minutes before the wind scatters it. It wasn't just a painting, it was a memory, rebuilt with intention. And it was ready. That week, Delilah invited us to dinner, to celebrate both my girls. She said. Claire had also been selected as a finalist. I brought dessert. Claire brought business cards. Delilah brought veiled insults. It's so nice they let hobbyists submit, she said at one point. Eyes locked on me. Really opens things up. I smiled. I'd been insulted more elegantly before. I could take it. But what happened the night before the showcase wasn't elegant. It wasn't careless. It was deliberate. At 3:12 a.m., I woke to the smell of turpentine and the sound of glass clinking. I followed it to my studio. And there, in the dark, standing beside my finished painting, with a solvent bottle in her hand, was Delilah. For a second, I couldn't speak. My mouth opened, but the words didn't come. Delilah didn't flinch. She slowly turned, holding the bottle like it was part of some innocent errand, as though we were in a grocery aisle and I'd caught her reaching for the wrong brand of cleaner. Taylor, she said calmly. You startled me. I didn't move. I didn't blink. The smell of the solvent hit stronger now, and I saw the streaks on the canvas glossy, wet, and intentional. What are you doing? I asked. My voice flat. She took a step back, feigning surprise. I bumped the table. The bottle fell. I was just trying to clean it up before you saw. I walked closer, slowly, and looked down at the damage. It wasn't a spill. It was a trail. Horizontal swipes across the most delicate glazes. The light I'd built over weeks now smudged into gray mud. This was no accident, I said, hearing the steadiness in my own voice, even though inside something was cracking. You did this on purpose. Delilah's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened around the bottle. Taylor, that's absurd. Why would I ever sabotage your work? I didn't answer. Jonathan appeared behind us, rubbing sleep from his eyes, confused by the light and the tension. What's going on? He asked. Delilah immediately shifted, as if the stage lights had come on. Oh, sweetheart, she said gently. I dropped a bottle of solvent in here by mistake. I was just admiring Taylor's painting. And the table must have been unstable. Jonathan looked at me. Then, at the painting. Then back at his mother. It's ruined, I said quietly. She didn't drop it. She applied it. Look at the strokes. Look at her hands. Delilah gasped, as if wounded. Taylor, how could you accuse me of that? She turned to Jonathan, eyes wide with manufactured hurt. I would never do something so cruel. Jonathan said nothing, just stared at the ruined canvas like it might reassemble itself if he waited long enough. You need to leave, I said to her. Now. Delilah gave me a patronizing look, then set the bottle down carefully, like it was evidence in a courtroom, and walked past me. I hope you can see reason in the morning, she said, before closing the studio door behind her. The room was silent. Jonathan didn't look at me. He stared at the wall. Do you believe me? I asked. He ran a hand through his hair. I don't know what to believe. She seemed sincere. I laughed once, dry and humorless. Of course she did. She always does. That's how people like her operate. You're upset, he said, is still not looking at me. Of course I'm upset. She destroyed the most important piece I've ever made. And you're standing there pretending. This might just be a misunderstanding. Maybe it's for the best, he said. I turned sharply. What I mean, he stammered. Maybe this wasn't your year. Maybe it's a sign to wait. Regroup. Apply next year. He wasn't trying to be cruel, but in that moment, I realized he didn't understand me at all. He thought I was a hobbyist who had taken a tumble. He didn't see what I'd built, what it cost, and what it meant. I turned away. Go back to bed, I said. I'll handle the rest. After he left, I sat on the floor for a long time, knees pulled to my chest, staring at the half-destroyed painting as the smell of chemicals clung to everything around me. I didn't cry right away. I just sat still, processing what had just happened. It wasn't just the act of destruction. It was the message. Delilah had looked at my work and decided that her daughter's success was threatened enough to warrant sabotage. And Jonathan had looked at that same work and decided that maybe this was for the best. Maybe I wasn't ready. Maybe failure was protection. Around fear. I stood up and washed my face in cold water. I didn't feel strong. I felt empty, but something stubborn sparked in the void. I picked up my phone and opened the photos folder. Over the past few months, I'd taken dozens of images, progress shots, lighting references, composition studies. I had the bones. I had the memory. I had 5 hours. A few days earlier, my friend Lena had given me a spare key to her studio while she was out of town. She lived 2 blocks away, in a converted loft, with a spare bedroom she used for mixed media work. I packed brushes, paints, a blank canvas, and a change of clothes. I left a note on the kitchen counter. Going to clear my head. Meet you at the venue. Then I stepped into the cold morning and walked to Lena's building. Heart pounding, hands shaking, mind on fire. I didn't know what I was going to paint. I just knew it couldn't be what I'd lost. It had to be something else. Something honest. By the time I stood in front of the blank canvas in Lena's studio, it was almost 5. The contest check-in started at 9. I had less than 4 hours. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and let everything rise. The betrayal, the exhaustion, the disappointment, the raw edge of being invisible for too long. And then, as if someone else moved my hand, I began. The first stroke wasn't careful. It wasn't even good. It was defiant. I wasn't thinking about technique anymore. I wasn't thinking about symmetry or depth or texture. I was thinking about breath, about standing on a cliff edge and not backing away. The paint went on too thick at first, then too fast. But I didn't stop to correct it. I just kept going. My hands moved on instinct, memory, and something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity. I wasn't trying to recreate the lake anymore. That scene was gone. This new canvas didn't deserve imitation. It demanded truth. So I gave it what I had left. I painted the figure of a woman, standing with her back to the viewer, shoulders squared against a storm sky. Behind her, the trees bent with wind. In front of her, water churned in movement. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't broken. She was present, alone, unprotected, and unafraid. Every part of her felt like me. I didn't stop to question whether it was good. There was no time. I moved fast, shifting from brushes to palette knives when I needed sharper angles. Using the side of my palm when blending failed, the paint layered thick in places, thin in others, but always deliberate. Around 7:30, the fatigue began to set in. My arms ached, my eyes stung, and my lower back pulsed from the strain. But I didn't pause. I couldn't. Something about the urgency made the distractions fall away. No phone. No noisy. No second guesses. Just creation. Pure and unfiltered. By 8:15, I set the brush down and stared at what I had made. It wasn't perfect. It didn't have the layered glow I'd spent months refining in my original painting. The colors were bolder, less blended. The edges were rough. But the emotional truth was unmistakable. I felt it staring back at me. That woman in the storm, using the carrying frame I'd built for the original painting. I mounted the still wet canvas with care. I wiped down my arms, pulled on the blue dress I'd planned to wear to the showcase, and tied my hair into a low bun. I didn't have time for anything else. I locked Lena's door behind me and climbed into her hatchback. The keys she'd left, dangling on the hallway hook. The gallery was only 15 minutes away, but every light felt longer than usual. I drove with one eye on the canvas, praying it wouldn't smear during transport. The air in the car smelled like linseed oil and adrenaline. I arrived just before 9, parking in the back lot behind the venue. Artists and handlers were already wheeling in carts, stretching bubble wrap, and adjusting easels. No one looked twice at me, and that was exactly what I needed. Inside, a volunteer scanned the participant list and checked my name. Taylor Swift. Space. 24, she said, handing me a badge. North Gallery. East Wall. I nodded and thanked her, walking carefully toward my assigned space. The gallery lighting was bright, clinical, unforgiving. Everything about the place whispered legitimacy. I passed rows of canvases still wrapped in brown paper or protected by translucent sheets. The air buzzed with nerves and polite tension. Claire's voice reached my ears before I saw her. She stood beside her painting already mounted, talking with another artist about her use of negative space and mixed mediums. Her eyes found me, then the canvas in my hands, then me again. "That's not the piece you submitted," she said, tilting her head. "No," I answered. "This one's new." Her brows lifted slightly, the way they always did when she was confused, but didn't want to admit it. Delilah was only a few feet behind her, dressed in muted neutrals, holding a program and a paper cup of tea. Her eyes landed on my painting, and something flickered disbelief, then disapproval. "What is this?" she asked. "Where's the lake?" I met her gaze. "Gone." "You can't be serious," she said. "This looks unfinished." "It's not meant to be polished," I replied. "It's meant to be honest." Her mouth tightened. Claire stepped closer, studying the canvas. She didn't speak at first, just looked. When she finally did, her voice was different. "You made this since last night. Since 4 a.m., I said. She didn't compliment it, but she didn't insult it either. She just stepped back and nodded once, as if mentally adjusting the competition's landscape in her head. I set up the easel, clipped the corners gently, and labeled the piece. I called it Inheritance. The irony wasn't lost on me. Everything Delilah had tried to preserve: status, hierarchy, the illusion of control had been passed down, like furniture. But this painting was my answer to that legacy. I wouldn't inherit her bitterness. I wouldn't inherit her obsession with perception. I'd inherited something different: pain. Yes, but also clarity. I stepped back from the canvas just as the doors opened to the public. Light from the windows stretched across the floor. People trickled in. The gallery began to breathe. The gallery began to fill slowly. The kind of crowd that moved in clusters, whispering in reverent tones, fingers tucked behind their backs as if afraid to breathe too close to the art. I stood near my assigned wall space, watching people pause in front of my painting, some just long enough to register it, others long enough to tilt their heads and step forward. It wasn't the kind of piece that invited technical admiration. It wasn't elegant. It didn't shimmer or speak the language of the trained eye. But it did something else. It held them. Not all, but a few. And those few stood there longer than they expected to, as if something in the woman facing the storm reminded them of someone they used to be. Claire came by again mid-morning. This time, without Delilah. She kept her hands folded in front of her, her posture perfect, as always. "The rawness is striking," she said, her voice low, almost neutral. It doesn't look like anything else here. I nodded, unsure whether she meant it as a compliment or critique. It wasn't supposed to. Well, she added, looking straight at the canvas. People are noticing. She walked away without waiting for a reply, her heels clicking softly across the gallery floor. I turned my attention back to the space in front of me, but not before catching sight of Jonathan at the far end of the room. He stood near the refreshments, holding a paper cup, eyes scanning the exhibits as if looking for a safe place to land. When he saw me, he came over. His tea was crooked. He looked like he hadn't slept. "You made it," he said, glancing at the painting. "Yeah," I answered. "I did." He studied it for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "I don't know how you did this overnight." "I didn't think. I just painted," I replied. "That's probably why it worked." "It's powerful," he said, his voice softening. "Different from your usual work." "I was different when I made it," I said. And for the first time, he didn't look away. There was a silence between us that wasn't entirely uncomfortable, just overdue. He started to say something, but the microphone crackled and pulled our attention toward the small podium set up in the center of the gallery. The director of the exhibition, Monroe, stepped forward. She was tall, silver-haired, and moved with the quiet certainty of someone used to holding a room. "Thank you all for joining us for this year's Colburn National Showcase," she began. "Out of nearly 500 submissions, we selected 30 finalists whose work reflects not just skill, but voice. The judging process was blind, as always, and we thank our panel for their thoughtful deliberation." She paused, scanning the crowd. "Today's award recipients were chosen for pieces that left a lasting emotional impression." My heart beat louder in my ears. I hadn't expected to win. I hadn't even dared to want it. I was still running on adrenaline and paint fumes. I told myself over and over that the victory had already happened, that I'd shown up, that I'd created something honest, that I hadn't let Delilah silence me. But still, standing there, I felt that same flicker of fragile hope I hadn't felt since the acceptance letter first arrived. They called honorable mentions first. Then, third place, Claire's name was announced. Her piece, Reconstruction, was awarded third prize. I looked over and saw her face stiffen in a polite smile as she made her way forward to accept the ribbon. Delilah clapped, but not enthusiastically. Claire accepted the certificate, nodded once, then returned to her place. Second place went to an artist from California whose work I hadn't yet seen. Monroe took a breath, and for a moment, the whole room felt like it was holding something in. "And finally," she said, her voice rising just slightly, "first place, along with a $10,000 prize and a featured exhibition next spring, goes to Space, 24 Taylor Swift, for Inheritance." I didn't move. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until someone near me clapped, and I felt the sound jolt me back into my body. I walked to the front of the gallery slowly, every step echoing against the hardwood floor. When Monroe handed me the award, her fingers lingered gently on mine. "Thank you for your courage," she said, so quietly, only I could hear it. "This is what art is for." When I turned back to the crowd, I didn't look for Delilah. I didn't look for Jonathan either. I looked at the painting, at the woman in the storm who refused to move. And I understood that in finishing this piece, I hadn't just claimed space on a gallery wall. I'd claimed space for myself. After the applause faded and the formalities were over, I stepped back from the podium and made my way through the gallery. People congratulated me in passing, some with quiet sincerity, others with professional detachment. A few asked about my technique or if the piece was part of a larger series. I answered politely, but my mind was somewhere else. I kept glancing toward the far end of the room, where Delilah stood near Claire, both of them noticeably silent. Claire's ribbon hung limp in her hand. Delilah looked as if someone had knocked the air out of her. though she was still trying to keep her posture intact. When she noticed me approaching, she straightened her shoulders and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said, her voice clipped. "That was unexpected." I met her gaze without blinking. "Only if you weren't paying attention." She studied me for a moment, like she was trying to find a soft spot. Some exposed vulnerability she could press her heel against. But I had nothing left to protect. I had already been broken and rebuilt. "Congratulations," she said finally, her tone empty. A bold choice of subject. Very timely. "It wasn't a choice," I replied. "It was the only thing I had left." She didn't respond. Claire looked away. I turned and walked past them. Not with arrogance, but with a kind of quiet gravity. I had nothing to prove anymore. Jonathan found me by the refreshment table. He looked as if he had 1,000 things to say, but didn't know where to begin. "You did it," he said. "You really did it." I gave him a small nod. "Yeah." A looked down, fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve. "About last night. About everything. I should have believed you." "Yes," I said quietly. "You should have." "I wasn't thinking clearly," he added, as if that might soften the fracture. "She's my mother." I didn't know how to process what I saw. I didn't want it to be true. But it was. I said, "You saw it. You just chose not to stand beside me when it counted." He nodded slowly, the weight of my words settling in his shoulders. "I know. And I'm sorry. I really am." There was a time when I would have cried hearing that. There was a time I would have clung to that apology like a life raft, grateful just to be seen again. But not today. Today, I didn't need permission to feel validated. I'd already walked through the fire. "We need help," I said calmly. "If you want to stay in this, if you want this marriage to work, we need to do the work. Together. Not just when it's convenient." His face softened. "I'm willing. Whatever it takes." "Then, we start from honesty," I said. "No more choosing silence to keep the peace." He reached for my hand. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't pull away. I didn't lean into him either. But I let him stay there beside me. And that was enough for now. Over the next few days, the aftermath unfolded slowly. I received emails from local press asking for interviews, invitations from galleries, requesting to view my portfolio, and even a direct message from a collector in New York who had seen a photo of inheritance online and wanted to know if it was for sale. I wasn't used to this kind of attention. I wasn't chasing it, but it came anyway. And this time, I didn't deflect it or downplay it. I answered every email. I spoke about the process. I told the truth when asked what inspired the piece. I didn't name names. But I didn't protect them either. I told them it came from betrayal. From being silenced. From refusing to give up. Delilah kept her distance. We didn't speak again until a week later. When she sent a short message through Jonathan, "Tell her the painting had impact." That was all. Not an apology. Not a concession. Just 5 cold words. And still, it felt like more than I'd ever expected to get from her. Claire, surprisingly, sent a note on her own. A simple card with her name at the bottom, and one sentence inside. "You found something I've never been brave enough to show." That one stayed on my desk for weeks. What I learned in those days wasn't loud. It came quietly. In the way people looked at me differently. In the way I looked at myself in the mirror and no longer second-guessed the reflection. For years, I had measured my worth by how safe I made others feel, how unthreatening, how soft-spoken, how agreeable. But the woman in the storm didn't apologize for her presence. She didn't ask to be accepted. She simply stood there and refused to disappear. 3 weeks after the competition, I received an invitation from the Lakeside Modern Gallery to participate in a winter feature alongside 2 other emerging artists. It wasn't the biggest gallery in the region, but it had a reputation for curating emotionally bold work and offering space to voices that didn't fit traditional molds. I accepted the offer without hesitation. There was no second-guessing this time. No wondering whether I deserved to be there. The gallery asked for 3 new pieces to accompany Inheritance, and I spent every morning and late night in the studio working on them. Each brushstroke keener, deeper, and more certain than the last. For the first time, I wasn't painting to prove I belonged. I was painting because I already knew I did. The studio space shifted too. Where it used to feel like a corner I had borrowed from my life, it now felt like the center of it. I stopped closing the door when I worked. Jonathan often sat outside the room with his laptop, sometimes reading quietly, sometimes just being present without interrupting. We started therapy the week after the competition, and while our progress wasn't quick or easy, it was real. For once, our conversations weren't about keeping the peace or making excuses for others. They were about what we allowed, what we enabled, and what needed to change if we were going to move forward. We weren't trying to return to who we used to be. We were slowly becoming something different, something sturdier. Delilah didn't come up much during those sessions, but she lingered in the margins. I knew eventually I'd have to face her, not as the woman who sabotaged me, but as someone who had held power over our family dynamic for far too long. That moment came sooner than I expected. When Jonathan's father, Robert, was admitted to the hospital after a mild heart episode. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough to rattle everyone, including Delilah. She called Jonathan first, asking him to come see her. He hesitated, then asked if I'd come with him. "I'm not sure she wants me there," I said. "That's exactly why I think you should come," he replied. So I did. Their house looked the same as always. Perfect landscaping. Art books stacked strategically on the coffee table. Fresh lilies in a crystal vase, but the energy was different. Delilah answered the door in a loose sweater and jeans. Her makeup, minimal. Hair, expression unguarded. "Taylor," she said. Surprised, but not cold. "Thank you for coming." I nodded once and stepped inside. We sat at the kitchen table, where so many strained family dinners had unfolded over the years. Robert was resting upstairs. The silence between us was dense. "I heard about the gallery," she said finally, pouring herself tea, but not offering any. "Congratulations." I studied her face for a moment before replying. "Thank you. It feels earned." She nodded slowly, eyes focused on the rim of her cup. "Claire mentioned, you've been doing interviews. People are talking about your work." "I know," I said. "It's strange, but not unwelcome." "I underestimated you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought you were dabbling. I thought it would pass." "You didn't just underestimate me," I said, calmly. "You tried to erase me." Her fingers tightened around the teacup. "I know, and I can't undo what I did." There was no apology, not in the traditional sense, but in her tone. In the stillness that followed, there was something close to it, something tired and cracked and maybe, for the first time, honest. "I saw the way Jonathan looked at you," she continued. "Not just as his wife, as a person, as someone doing something that mattered. And it scared me." "Why?" I asked. She looked up at me, eyes glossy but not broken. "Because I spent years building this version of the world where Claire was the artist and I was the curator. I didn't know where you fit in that picture, and I didn't like that I didn't know." I sat back slightly, letting her words land. "You could have just asked," I said. "You could have chosen curiosity over control." We didn't reach peace that afternoon, but we did reach clarity, and that, for me, was enough. When Jonathan and I left their house, he reached for my hand again. This time, I let him hold it longer. In the months that followed, Inheritance was sold to a private collector for 3 times what I'd ever priced a piece before. The gallery, requested a solo feature the following year. I began mentoring a small group of young artists, not because I thought I had all the answers, but because I finally understood the power of being seen. One night, while packing up after a community workshop, a teenage girl came up to me and asked if I had ever felt like people didn't take me seriously. I smiled gently and said, "Once, but they do now." Because I didn't stop. Her face lit up like she'd just received permission to exist. That's what this journey had become for me. Not a battle for revenge, not a campaign to expose anyone, but a quiet reclamation of space, of identity, of the right to create without explanation. The woman in the storm didn't just survive it. She walked straight through and found her voice on the other side. It was during a panel discussion at the gallery's winter feature that I finally realized how far I'd come. Not just as an artist, but as a person who no longer flinched when asked to speak. The moderator, a sharp but kind curator from Raleigh, asked each of us what moment had defined our current work. I didn't hesitate. I told them it wasn't a class or a mentor or a specific brush technique. It was a moment of silence at 3 a.m. Standing in front of a ruined painting, realizing no one was coming to save me. I told them it wasn't courage that made me pick up a new canvas. It was something smaller, but more stubborn. A refusal to disappear quietly. When I finished speaking, the room didn't clap right away. They just sat still, taking it in. That pause, that breath of respect, meant more than any applause. After the event, I found myself alone in the gallery, walking past the work still on display. Inheritance hung on the far wall under a soft spotlight, surrounded by pieces that were technically sharper, more controlled, but it still held the room in a different way. A couple walked by and lingered, reading the small placard beneath the frame. The woman tilted her head, then whispered something to her partner. He nodded. They didn't know I was standing nearby, but I watched as she reached out not to touch the painting, but to hold his hand. That was when I knew the piece had done its job. It had made someone feel less alone. That night, I sat in the studio past midnight, not painting, but sketching ideas. Not every idea becomes a painting. Some stay on the page for months or even years, waiting for the right version of me to meet them. One of the sketches was of a woman holding her own reflection, not in a mirror, but in a canvas. Raw and unfinished. It wasn't graceful. It was fractured. But she was still looking. I didn't know what I'd name it yet, but I knew it was coming next. I let myself sit with the quiet, with the hum of the house and the sound of my pencil dragging lightly across paper. Jonathan had fallen asleep on the couch outside the studio, his book resting on his chest. The room no longer felt divided. It felt lived in, shared without conditions. The next morning, I found an envelope under the studio door. Inside was a short note written in Claire's handwriting. No greeting. No signature. Just one line. Would you ever consider a joint exhibition? I read it twice. Then I set it on the desk and stared out the window. For years, Claire and I had lived like distant planets, orbiting the same family sun. Her path had always been sanctioned, praised, and funded. Mine had been doubted, minimized, and questioned. But somehow, despite everything, we had both arrived in the same place, two women trying to turn emotion into form. I didn't answer immediately. I let the question sit, not because I was angry or unsure, but because I needed to be certain I wasn't saying yes out of politeness or obligation. I would only do it if I believed in the art, in the conversation it could create, in the contrast between what was taught and what was felt. When I finally wrote back, I kept it short. Maybe, if we choose the theme together. Her reply came later that week. A single word. Deal. Planning the exhibition wasn't easy. We disagreed on approach, on tone, even on the lighting for the main room. But we kept talking. And somewhere in that messy process, the wall between us started to thin. Not vanish entirely, but shift just enough to see through. Claire didn't apologize for her past comments, and I didn't ask her to. But she did tell me something that stayed with me. Mom expected me to be brilliant, so I learned how to look the part. You never had that pressure. You had freedom, and that terrified her. It made sense. Delilah had mistaken my independence for rebellion, my softness for weakness. Claire had been her masterpiece. I was the threat she didn't know how to frame. The joint show opened the following spring. We called it Divergence. My favorite moment came early in the evening, when a young girl walked up to one of my new paintings, a portrait of a woman pulling thread from her own chest, and said, "This one feels like when I cry." But nobody notices. I thanked her quietly and wrote that sentence down as soon as she walked away. Not for marketing, just to remember why I keep showing up. Art doesn't solve everything. It doesn't erase betrayal or rewrite the past. But it holds it. It frames it. It gives it weight and shape, so it doesn't have to live unnamed inside you. I used to think revenge was about proving someone wrong. Now I understand it's about proving yourself right. Quietly, relentlessly, until the life you're living no longer requires anyone's permission. The months that followed were quiet in the best way. I wasn't chasing anything. I wasn't explaining myself to anyone. I just worked. I painted in the morning, walked along the French Broad River in the afternoons, and came home to dinners that no longer felt like performances. Jonathan and I weren't perfect, but we were honest. He no longer apologized with gifts or silence. He showed up for therapy, for late-night conversations, for mornings when I needed coffee and stillness more than small talk, and slowly, without drama or fanfare, we rebuilt something that felt less like a recovery and more like a new beginning. Delilah didn't reach out again after that kitchen conversation, and I didn't chase her. Her silence wasn't cruel. It was just absence, and that was its own form of peace. Claire and I continued planning projects. Not frequently, not formally, but with a rhythm that no longer felt competitive. We had found different truths through similar tools. And even though our lives had been shaped by different expectations, we met in the one place that didn't care about titles or work. I wasn't trying to outshine her, and for the first time, I didn't think she was trying to outshine me. We were just painting. Inheritance remained on loan to a museum in Charleston for a rotating exhibit on modern storytelling through form. I visited once, quietly, without letting anyone know I had arrived. I walked through the space like a stranger, watching people stop and look. Some paused. Some moved on quickly. Some whispered to the person beside them. But one woman, middle-aged, hair in a loose bun, tote bag slung over one shoulder, stood longer than the rest. Her eyes stayed on the figure in the painting, unmoving. And then she exhaled, like the breath she'd been holding finally let go. I didn't speak to her. I didn't introduce myself. I just sat on the bench nearby and watched as something passed between her and the canvas that no curator's label could explain. That night, back at the hotel, I thought about what Delilah had said in our last conversation, that she didn't know where I fit. And I realized the mistake hadn't been hers alone. For a long time, I'd accepted a version of myself that was easier for others to understand. I was the quiet one, the polite one, the girl who left the room before things got loud. But people underestimate quiet women. They forget how much silence holds. Not retreat, not fear, but observation, strategy, timing. They don't see it until you walk into the storm they made for you and refuse to flinch. One morning, just after New Year's, I received a handwritten letter in the mail. No return address. Just my name in strong, familiar handwriting. I recognized it immediately. It was from Delilah. Inside, no grand gestures, just 2 paragraphs. She wrote that she had watched an interview I gave about the role of grief in creative work. That something I said about painting being a way to claim agency made her stop mid-sentence and think. She didn't mention what she'd done. She didn't ask for forgiveness. But she wrote that watching me stand in front of inheritance during the awards ceremony made her feel something she hadn't expected: pride. Then fear. Then grief. She said she realized it was never about the painting. It was about her losing control over what came next. I read the letter twice. Then I put it back in the envelope and slid it into the drawer beside my desk. I didn't need to respond. There are some things silence answers better than words. The spring exhibition at the gallery came and went, followed by an offer to teach a masterclass at a small liberal arts college nearby. I almost declined. Teaching hadn't been part of the plan. But the thought of sitting in a room with students still unsure of their voice reminded me of where I had started: alone, afraid, and tired of pretending I didn't care. So I accepted. On the first day of class, I wrote a single sentence on the board. You don't have to be chosen to create. No one spoke at first. Then a girl in the back raised her hand and asked, "So how do we know when we're good enough?" I paused, then told her the truth. You'll know when you stop asking them and start answering yourself. That became the theme of everything I did that year. Not proving myself to others. Not defending my choices. But trusting the quiet certainty that built inside me during the darkest hours. The night Delilah tried to destroy my painting didn't become a wound I carried. It became a turning point. Not because of what she did, but because of what I chose to do next. I didn't fight her in public. I didn't demand apologies. I created something so undeniable, it spoke louder than anything she could have said. There was something strangely calming about walking into a room where no one knew who I was. At the college, I wasn't the woman who won the showcase or the artist who painted in 5 hours after Sabotage. I was just Taylor, the instructor, the guest speaker, and it allowed me to meet people without expectations layered between us. My students were raw and curious and beautifully unsure of themselves. They asked questions that didn't come from ego but from hunger. They didn't need permission to create. They needed someone to tell them it was okay to feel lost while doing it. One afternoon, after class, a student named June lingered by the window, arms crossed. Hiltilde. What if your family doesn't get it? She asked. What if they think you're wasting your time? I didn't offer her a quote or a lesson. I just told her the truth. Then you keep going until it doesn't matter if they do. She looked at me like she wanted to believe that, but wasn't sure how. I remembered that look. I'd worn it for years. It takes time to stop asking the wrong people for the right kind of validation. Outside the classroom, my work continued to evolve. Not in technique, but in voice. The more I stopped filtering my instincts through imagined approval, the more clearly the work spoke for itself. One of my newest pieces, a mixed media canvas titled Second Silence. It was selected for a traveling exhibition on transformation and resistance. It didn't feature a storm or a lake or even a figure, just texture layered on texture. Shapes blurred into suggestion. When asked what it represented, I said it was what came after the chaos the stillness earned, not given. Claire and I stayed in contact, though we never became close in the way siblings might have hoped, but we respected each other. That was enough. She invited me to attend one of her solo exhibits in Raleigh, and I went. She introduced me as the reason I stopped hiding behind technique, and even though she said it lightly, I knew she meant it. We didn't talk much that night. But when I was leaving, she hugged me quickly and whispered, "I'm glad we made it out of that house." I didn't need to ask what she meant. We both knew the walls she was talking about. Delilah's name didn't come up again until nearly a year after the competition. Jonathan and I had just returned from a weekend in Savannah when he found a voicemail from her. Short, quiet, restrained. She'd been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. It wasn't urgent, she said. She didn't want to fuss. She was just letting us know. I stood by the sink while Jonathan played it for me. We didn't say anything right away. He looked at me like he was waiting for permission to feel conflicted. I gave him a small nod. "Go see her," I said. "You'll regret it." if you don't. He drove to Asheville alone that Saturday, and I stayed home in the studio. I didn't need to be there. Whatever closure needed to happen between them, it wasn't mine to manage. When he returned, he didn't say much, just that she looked different, softer, smaller, that she asked about my work, that she'd seen my latest piece in a catalog and said it reminded her of something Claire had painted when she was 16. I took that in quietly. I wasn't looking for reconciliation, but maybe she was. A month later, I received a box in the mail. No return label, just my name written in clean, familiar handwriting. Inside was a wrapped folder and a small envelope. The folder contained early photos of my first community, show the one no one from the family had attended. I didn't even know photos had been taken. But she had them. The envelope held a card. Inside, one sentence. Some storms exist to clear paths. No signature. No explanation. Just that. I stared at the words for a long time. Then I slipped the card into the back of my sketchbook and let it rest there. The next week, I spoke at a citywide art summit, this time on a panel about ownership and authorship in creative identity. My final words weren't rehearsed. I just told the audience what I now knew to be true. You don't need to burn bridges to build boundaries. You don't need revenge to reclaim truth. You just need to be louder than the people who hope you stay small. I stepped off the stage and didn't look back. 6 months after the exhibition, I was invited to give a talk at a creative resilience workshop hosted by a local nonprofit. I almost declined. Not because I wasn't honored, but because I wasn't sure I had anything new to say. I'd told my story. I'd survived it. I'd moved forward. But something told me it was worth showing up, not as the person who triumphed, but as someone still learning to hold peace after the storm. So I went. The room was small, filled with folding chairs, mismatched mugs of tea, and faces that reminded me of my younger self, eager, hesitant, quietly waiting for someone to tell them they weren't broken. I spoke honestly. I told them about the contest, about how my painting had been ruined just hours before the final showcase. I didn't say her name. I didn't need to. What mattered wasn't the villain in the story, but the part where I stopped trying to make everyone understand my pain and started creating from it. When I finished, a woman in the back raised her hand and asked, "Do you ever wish you'd fought back harder?" I paused for a moment, then answered as plainly as I could. No. I think building something they can't take away was louder. After the talk, a teenage girl approached me with a sketchpad clutched to her chest. She didn't say much. Just that her stepmother once burned her comics in front of her friends, and that she hadn't drawn since. I didn't tell her to forgive. I didn't tell her to be strong. I just looked her in the eye and said, "You don't owe anyone silence." She nodded, as if the words didn't fix anything but helped her breathe a little easier. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected. Back in the studio, I started a new series called Unframed. Each piece focused on fragments, scratches, brush slip-ups, raw textures left visible. No corrections. No erasures. It was a way of saying, here's what survived. Critics didn't know what to make of it at first. Some called it unfinished. Others called it brave. But for once, I didn't care what they called it. The work felt honest. It belonged to no one's expectations but mine. One morning, I received a message from the gallery director who had hosted the competition where everything changed. She invited me to be a guest curator for their next regional exhibition, the theme Inheritance. I didn't hesitate. I chose pieces from artists whose work spoke not of legacy in the traditional sense, but of quiet reclamation women who built their identity not from what was passed down, but from what they salvaged. Delilah never reached out again. I don't know if she ever saw my newer work. I don't know if she'd changed. But that no longer sat heavy in me. Not every story has to end with confrontation. Sometimes healing is quiet. I lived out in choices no one claps for. What mattered more was that I no longer arranged my decisions around her shadow. That summer, Jonathan and I drove up to a lakeside town for a short retreat. It was the same lake I used to visit as a child with my aunt, the one where I'd first learned to paint reflections on water using a plastic cup and cheap brushes. I brought a small canvas, not for work, just for memory. I sat by the dock while he read beside me, and I painted the water as it moved, no outlines. No plan. Just motion and light and silence. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. When I finished, I signed it with only my initials and placed it back in the box with the first sketch I'd saved from the ruined painting all those months ago. Some people still ask me if I'll ever confront her, or at least tell the full story publicly. I usually just smile, not because I'm avoiding the question, but because the real story was never about her. It was about what I rebuilt afterward. About the parts of myself I met only after being forced to start over. About the power of not needing anyone else's apology to move forward. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: art isn't always about expression. Sometimes, it's about endurance. About having something that's still yours after the noise fades, after the doors close, after the people who hurt you forget your name. And when that day comes, and you're still here, still creating, still choosing not to vanish, that is the most permanent kind of victory there is.